Welcome back to Mean Streets here on Game Plus Network. Chris Meaney with Michael Beller of The Athletic. You can check him out at The Athletic, of course, and tune into his several different podcasts. Beller, the Chicago Bears. Let's preview the Bears here. This is a team you follow pretty closely. They're 65 to 1 to win the Super Bowl. NFC North to win that division plus 550. The playoffs plus 225. I saw it just to get the wild card spot was plus 425. So I think that's better odds than just picking them to make the playoffs. If you don't think they're going to win the division, maybe plus 425 there. And the win total at 7.5. So we have some of their weapons on the board here, Beller. But before we get to them from a fantasy standpoint, what do you think overall of the Bears, their offseason and heading into this year? It seems like Chicago fans should be excited.
Dress for the occasion. Meaney got my favorite best Peanut Tillman shirt on right here. I am super excited for the Bears this year. Let's remember that this team went 8-8 each of the last two seasons with some truly horrendous quarterback play. So there was already a pretty strong roster around the rest of the team. And now you add, even if for however long Andy Dalton's playing, that's a quarterback upgrade from what they got out of Mitch Trubisky and Nick Foles last year. And then, of course, Justin Fields, who everyone's painting to be the savior here in Chicago. I am right there with them. Again, talking Big Ten football, I saw this guy carve up defense week after week after week after week in the Big Ten. And so I feel very good about where this offense is pointed and thereby where this entire team is pointed. I feel like the division is a bit of an ask with Aaron Rodgers back in Green Bay and that team that has gone to two straight NFC Championship games being basically intact. But I think the Bears are absolutely a realistic playoff contender. And as I am getting ready to make my future wagers, there's definitely going to be some money placed on the Bears to make the playoffs, maybe in that wild card range, as you said. And I'll admit there's like 20% of my heart involved there, but it's mostly making the bet with the head because I really think this team is pointed in the right direction.
Yeah, listen, some people we come on here and they're homers with their teams and I have to tell them to settle down, but I knew you weren't going to be like that anyways from doing best on the board with you and how many times you said, no, I'm not picking the Bears here today. I'm picking against the Bears. Or you and I just picking against the Eagles and picking against the Bears and having a lot of fun on that show and breaking things down. So if you're not getting your bets from FTN, make sure you get your bets from Beller when he gives them to you throughout the NFL season. Okay, Justin Fields, you just alluded to him a little bit. I was shocked that like a team like Denver didn't grab him or a team moved up to get him. And then you hear reports of Zach Wilson really struggling, like getting no pressure in practice, taking 5 seconds to throw and not hitting anybody. And then Justin Fields, like glaring reports from him, QB 18, ADP 145 in NFFC leagues over the last 2 weeks. Beller, like, let's try to play this out. Like you mentioned Andy Dalton, and we'll get to Robinson in a little bit. Whether it's Fields or Dalton, this will be the best quarterback. Whoever it is will be the best quarterback that Robinson has ever played with, which is crazy to think about. And he's had some really good seasons in the NFL, 150 plus targets in like 4 of his last 5, with it including that one injury season. But for Fields, when does this guy start? And if he is starting, say it is week 5, for example, or whatever week it is, and he's in there and it's maybe his second week or his third week, where are you ranking him on a week-to-week basis? Like this guy with the rushing upside and some of the weapons that he has in this offense, we have to think about him as a borderline QB1, don't we?
I think we do. I think a good analog for him is Jalen Hurts from last year when Hurts stepped in and took over as the starter in Philly. I think that's just a good way to conceptualize where he will be slotting if and when he does take over as the starter. The interesting thing is that the Bears start the season week 1 at the Rams on Sunday Night Football. Then they come home for the Bengals. Then they're at the Browns, home for the Lions, at the Raiders. It's not the worst schedule to start the season. And so that's all to say, if they go 3-2, 4-1 in that stretch and Andy Dalton's playing decently, I think there is a tiny bit more risk to Justin Fields and when he takes over as the starter than is being accounted for. At the same time, the seat is already hot for Matt Nagy. Even though he made the trade up, the seat is hot for Ryan Pace as the GM. And so they want to see the guy who they drafted to be the face of the franchise and save their jobs in there sooner rather than later. So I do think that week 4, week 5 is a fair expectation for Justin Fields, and that the moment he takes over as the starter, he'll instantly be in that QB1 range. And he'll have to prove it to us that he can live in that QB1 range. But with what we saw from him at Ohio State, what we expect from him at the NFL level, that when he does take over, we should probably be slotting him as like QB14 and let him go from there.
Yeah, Matt Nagy had said he's getting close. He's not there yet, but he's picking the playbook up pretty quickly, which I'm not surprised in. Yeah, this guy, if you watch him last year, you mentioned some of his college games and just just a baller, man. Like when he got smacked in that, was it the championship game when he got
The
smacked
semifinal against Clemson.
in the ribs,
Yeah.
and he just and nothing phased him, and he was making throws down the field. Again, I was shocked that he went as late as he did, and good on the Bears to move up and solidify this guy and get the quarterback of the future. So quickly, are you taking shots on him? In Superflex, it's easy to take shots on him, but is this a guy that maybe you would draft at the end? You already have a quarterback for the first few weeks. Maybe it's a Tannehill or a Hurts or whatever, whoever it is, somebody that you would take on and stash on your bench, and just knowing that when he does start, give you that floor and could be that guy? Or is it just looking at that schedule, knowing that the Bears could probably win a few games with Dalton, and he could just stay on your bench for quite a bit?
Yeah, in one quarterback leagues, I'm probably not. The only way I'm taking that shot on him in one quarterback leagues is if it's a league where people generally do draft backups, and so maybe I feel like I got to get in on him now while I can. Otherwise, it's just there's too many unknowns. There's too many unknowns surrounding him for me to burn a spot for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks on a backup quarterback, on a luxury backup quarterback, on a guy who, I mean, you mentioned Ryan Tannehill. Like, I love Justin Fields. I'm super pumped about Justin Fields. How many weeks would I start Justin Fields over Ryan Tannehill in a one quarterback league? Like, not that many necessarily.
Right.
So I'm probably staying away from him in those 1 QB formats. But Superflex, no doubt about it. The interesting thing about Superflex is if he is going as QB 18 and he's not going to start the first couple of weeks of the season, you're going to have to get a luxury backup. You're going to have to get a luxury QB3. You're going to have to come out of it with like Justin Fields and Baker Mayfield as your QB2, QB3, or Justin Fields and Ryan Fitzpatrick, someone like that. So that's something you're going to have to think about as you're allocating draft day resources in 2 QB or Superflex leagues if Fields ends up being on your team. But definitely someone who I think from the moment he takes over for Andy Dalton is a pretty easy 2 QB Superflex starter.
David Montgomery, RB 17, ADP 32. So I mentioned earlier in this show with you about everyone wanted to give the pass to Jonathan Taylor for the soft schedule, but nobody wanted to give the pass for Dave Montgomery for that soft schedule towards the end of the season. He finished as RB 4 in half-point settings, standard settings, and PPR settings, believe it or not, because he hit career highs across the board, 1,500 total yards. He was very involved through the air, 54 grabs, 68 targets. I know Tariq Cohen is coming back slowly, not yet on the field, and they brought in Damian Williams, and I think that's where people have the pause to draft Dave Montgomery, is because Damian Williams has been known to be a decent pass catcher. I'm not a Damian Williams fan. I am not. Like, maybe it's from the years of Jake Seeley just talking up Damian Williams and the small sample that we had with the Chiefs. He didn't play football last year. I know you probably heard positive reports from him in camp. There's been a few that he's, picking up the playbook, and he probably will be involved in a third down role. But why are people so sour on Montgomery and where he's going? I think he makes for a rock solid RB2 with upside that we already know to be an RB1. Are you in or out on Montgomery?
Definitely in on Montgomery at cost. I agree with you. Rock solid where he's going. I'm not going to be the person who treats him as the RB4 from last season. I just don't think that that's really in the cards for him. Speaking of Jake, our buddy Jake, he made a point on our podcast earlier this week that if you throw some of the injured guys from last season back into the rankings, Christian McCaffrey, Saquon Barkley, give Joe Mixon a full season, it's easy to see where David Montgomery could be exactly the guy he was last year and fall down to RB10 or RB12. And if he's the exact guy he was last year, all those guys are healthy. He has a tiny bit of regression, and now he's RB14, RB16. Like, I think that's a fair point.
Sure.
But that doesn't mean that he should be faded at that cost. And I agree with you on Damian Williams. I think he's going to have a role. I think he's going to have a larger role in Chicago's offense than any non-Montgomery back had last season. But let's remember what he was, right? A late bloomer who broke out in the Patrick Mahomes environment in Kansas City. I think a lot of running backs could have done that. That's not a knock on Damian Williams. That's just an acknowledgement of what the reality is. So now he comes to Chicago. He hasn't played football in a year. He obviously is comfortable with this offense, having been paired up with Matt Nagy previously in Kansas City. But David Montgomery is going to be the guy who runs this backfield. And David Montgomery proved last year that he can catch the ball. 54 catches on 68 targets. I mean, he can be an effective receiver. He did that at Iowa State a little bit too. So he can do really everything the Bears ask of him. And I do think that he is a very comfortable RB2. I have him as RB16. I have him just behind Chris Carson. I actually have him one spot ahead of Najee Harris, which is a completely different conversation. Basically means I'm just not going to get Najee Harris anywhere. But the guys who I have him rubbing elbows with, Chris Carson, Mike Davis, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, DeAndre Swift. I have him ahead of Davis and Swift behind Edwards-Helaire and Chris Carson. And so I'll be totally comfortable taking him right in that range. And I do think a ceiling still exists for him where he pushes up into the top 10. That relies on Dalton/Fields raising the overall competency for the Bears offense.
The Harris thing is a conversation for another day. I wish you would have told me that. We could have chatted about that a little bit. Interesting. Yeah, I got him right after Carson, too. Carson at 16, Montgomery at 17. So Montgomery was interesting here. Just like he finished with 85.8 fewer fantasy points than Derrick Henry, but he had 10 fewer fantasy points than Henry in a PPR setting from week 5 on. Again, we know that Henry isn't involved through the air, but I just thought it was interesting to know, like, from week 5 to the end of the season, these guys were right on par with each other, depending on what setting you played. The boost for Montgomery in a full point, but even in a half point, he's right there with Derrick Henry as a guy who was just, I don't know if Matt Nagy just kind of, he seems like a slow learner a little bit in Montgomery's first year, not giving him the touches, and it took a while. And then who knows if we would have saw Montgomery run as many routes as he did and catch all those balls and just thinking, yeah, he wouldn't have. But we probably wouldn't have. And they would have continued to roll a Tariq Cohen, who's got, well, he had back-to-back, I think, 70-plus catch seasons before the injury. And then they bring in Williams. But, yeah, we never would have seen this side of Montgomery, which was nice to see because I was completely in on him in his rookie season, and he made me look absolutely foolish. But I am in on Montgomery, and I love this price. And let's get into some of their pass catchers. I don't know what there is really to say about Allen Robinson, but wide receiver 12, ADP 31, top 10 wideout in each of the past 2 seasons. Beller, 150 targets, as I mentioned earlier, in 4 of his last 5. I didn't include the 2017 season where he suffered the injury in week 1. 70 yards or a touchdown in 12 of his 16 games last season. An absolute stud. And like we talked about, man, just he's going to have the best quarterback he's ever played with, whether it's Dalton to start or it's Fields to finish the year. I would assume that you're in on Allen Robinson.
In a huge way, Mooney. I mean, you said wide receiver, top 10 wide receiver, both of the last 2 seasons with Mitch Trubisky and Nick Foles as his quarterbacks. And now we're talking about him falling outside the top 10. Getting the quarterback upgrade, getting probably the offensive as a whole upgrade, a team that should be expected to run some more plays this year, get more yards, get more points. Like, forget about that. I know it is a crowded group of wide receivers, and I'm not pushing him ahead of Devontae or Tyreek Hill or Stephon Diggs, Calvin Ridley, anyone like that. But he's my wide receiver 7. I've got him ahead of DK Metcalf. I've got him ahead of A.J. Brown. I've got him ahead of Keenan Allen, sandwiched in between DK behind him and Justin Jefferson in front of him. He is going to be a target monster again this season, and I love Darnell Mooney as much as anyone. I know we're going to talk about him in a second, but this is still Allen Robinson. This is still Allen Robinson's group, Allen Robinson's wide receiver room. He's going to get that 140, 150 targets again this season, and just think about what he can do with a better quarterback, with potentially a rising star quarterback in Justin Fields on a better offense than arguably he's ever been in, a better environment. Just every single thing that is around Allen Robinson has never been this good for him in his career. And we know why we're talking about him in this context, because he's been awesome, even with all those bad offenses around him. So I just think that he is someone who deserves to be drafted as a comfortable top 10 receiver. And I'll finish it with this, Mooney, I'll finish it with this here. Just look at the fact that he's going to dominate the targets in Chicago along the same lines as probably Devontae Adams in Green Bay, Calvin Ridley in Atlanta, Steph Diggs in Buffalo, and maybe that's it. I think those 4 guys have the surest 27% plus target share of anyone in the NFL. So you give him that with a better offense, and I think really the sky's the limit here for Allen Robinson this season.
He seems to be I talk with some of my buddies who, follow fantasy football as much as us, but they don't have the mic or the opportunity to talk about it, with others. And they always say, like, there's 2 guys inside the top 10 that I feel like get disrespected. It's Robinson and it's Keenan Allen. Both of those guys inside the top 10 is just like target hogs. And to your point, I mean, Allen Robinson, my goodness, like, I just so happy for him that he's going to have a capable quarterback this year. We only got about a minute and a half, and I know you're big on Mooney. Heck, you called me Mooney. I mean, he's a rising star in the league, and there were so many clips last year, Beller, with Mooney running great routes and passes just way over his head or underthrown. Talk to me about Mooney and maybe touch on Cole Kmet. Maybe you need to scale down my love for Cole Kmet potentially. And if it is, then just
I'm not going to do
Mooney. That's it.
No, I'm not going to be scaling down any Cole Kmet love. I think he takes over as the primary tight end, and an offense that definitely wants to use the tight end. We know what he did at Notre Dame. I'm with you on Cole Kmet. My favorite, if I miss out, tight end to go after is Cole Kmet. Darnell Mooney, I can keep this pretty simple. Pandemic season, no OTAs, no training camp, no preseason games. horrible quarterback play. He gives you 61, 631, and 4. All that's gone. He has a full NFL season under his belt. He gets a real summer. He gets a real quarterback, and he is clearly the wide receiver 2. No more Anthony Miller to contend with here. The Bears did bring in some other guys, Damiere Byrd, right? But there's not going to be anyone who really pushes him. The obvious wide receiver 2 in this offense, and a big guy who can step up for the Bears. I think a season of 75, 805, 75, 850, and 6 is easily within range for him.
Absolutely. Wide receiver 49, ADP 115. And I think that's a steal. I think he's got upside to be a wide receiver 3, and he's not getting drafted like that. Beller, you're fantastic, buddy. I appreciate you taking the time here to join me today. Michael Beller at MBeller on Twitter. Check out all of his work over at The Athletic.